Good morning and welcome to the Point. In a week where Governor Whitmer has significantly reduced the restrictions surrounding the coronavirus pandemic, there was another issue that gripped our state. That was the death of George Floyd. Earlier in the week, there was a town hall hosted by Wood TV and our sister station WLNS. We had 10 members of the U.S. House and both of our U.S. senators. We asked all of them what their role was in trying to heal a nation that is concerned about racial inequity. And the question is, what specific strategies on the federal level do you propose to prevent further police brutality? How quickly can Congress work on drafting bills that incorporate said strategies? We'll start with Congresswoman Slot. Congresswoman, what are your thoughts on what Congress could or should do in the wake of all of this unrest?
Sure. So a number of us were just having this conversation in a bipartisan way as part of the Problem Solvers Caucus, a bipartisan caucus of Democrats and Republicans. And listen, I don't think anyone could watch that video of what happened to George Floyd and not feel just exhausted and furious with what happened. And it's really just a moment where we have to face some of these long-term inequalities that we know have been there for a long time. We talked about it in a legislative way by looking at what we can do at the national level on reform, particularly for the police officers. We had members of the Congressional Black Caucus come and brief us with ideas related to, looking at some of the policemen who stood by and maybe either participated or watched. What are the responsibilities that the police officers have when they are bad apples, when there are people that aren't obeying the spirit or the letter of the law? So there's a bunch of pieces of legislation that are being worked on now. And my hope certainly is that we can do this in a bipartisan way. I think the country wants that and they need that right now.
Let's move to Congressman Upton. The city of Kalamazoo, the scene of unrest this week and also the scene of some peaceful protests. Your thoughts on what's happening in your home district?
Well, we have to realize that there really is injustice here that needs to be dealt with the right way. I too am a member of the Problem Solvers Caucus, a bipartisan group of 50 members. And we met on a Zoom call literally in the last hour. We talked about a lot of different options. For me, I've reached out to a good number, and me and my staff have reached out to a good number of the community leaders. I joined a peaceful protest in Benton Harbor earlier this week. But we have to also denounce the violence because that sets us back. Nobody really wants to see us go back. We need to go forward. We have to recognize that we have immense problems that we have to deal with. And that's why I'm convinced that the Problem Solvers Caucus and an agenda that we're going to be working on literally the rest of the week and when Congress comes back into session can deal with some of these things to make sure that, in fact, there is accountability, that we can look at new standards, and we can look at the inherent problems that have caused this issue to rise to the front burner.
Thank you for that. Let's check in now with Congresswoman Dingell. What is your take, especially in the Metro Detroit area?
Dr. Martin Luther King taught us that riots are the language of the unheard. It is still a reality in this country. The nuns taught this to me at a very young age, that I was lucky. I was a child of privilege. That yes, we were all created equally, but we're not all treated equally. What we have witnessed in the last couple of weeks is just a reminder of what young Black men, quite frankly, in particular, but if you are African American in this country, the reality of being treated differently. I think we're at a crossroads. I think we all have to work together because, to quote President Kennedy, if not us, who? If not now, when? And I think this is a time when we must address it. We've had, unfortunately, some issues in Washtenaw County in the last 10 days too, and community is coming together to demand accountability, but to work together. I spoke at a rally in Ann Arbor on Monday, and our police chief, our sheriff, and leaders of the community walked together, including our football coach on Tuesday.
Congressman Molinar, quickly, if we can move on to Congressman Molinar and your thoughts, please.
Sure. Well, first, I want to commend those who protested peacefully because there was an injustice for George Floyd, and our hearts go out to his family. There clearly is a problem with racial bias, and it's something that we need to have better training in our law enforcement. I think we also need to put together the bipartisan coalition that passed criminal justice reform and work together to address this problem as well. On the other hand, those who were looting, those who were destructive of property, there should be no tolerance for that. That doesn't help bring justice to the nation. That only brings further discord. And we need to work together to promote racial reconciliation in this country. And I think it begins with our leaders in Congress, and we need to work together. And I think that coalition that passed criminal justice reform is exactly what we need to do to move forward.
And Congressman Huizinga, you've seen what's unfolded in West Michigan. Your reaction to this tonight?
Yeah, I like everyone else, was absolutely repulsed by what had happened to George Floyd, and that is not acceptable. And I can tell you, I've not met a single person or talked to a single person who believes that was acceptable, including police officers. Every single police officer I've talked to or even heard on the media. What I think we need to talk about, though, is what are some of those practical sides. And to me, one of those things is transparency. And it could be as simple as making sure that body cams are available, and maybe in some cases mandatory. Making sure that there is adequate training, making sure that there's additional training. Pete Stauber, who is a congressman from Minnesota, some might recognize his name. He actually played for the Red Wings for a while, then spent 25 years in law enforcement. And I was on a call with him earlier today, as was Fred Upton. And he was talking about the state taking charge of some additional training that could go into that. And I think those are some practical things that we also need to talk about in addition to this larger community discussion on healing.
With all the unrest around the country in the wake of the death of George Floyd, we all need to be coming together. Congressman Kildee, we will begin with you. What are you doing to work across the aisle through all of this?
I think it is notable that since the coronavirus pandemic hit us, Congress actually has been able to work in a bipartisan. We passed 4 bipartisan bills in the history of the country. People would have been shocked to see that, but we did it. We came together. That does not mean that we don't have differences. But I think what we've seen when our backs are against the wall is that the muscle memory, 6-month memory of our democracy is still pretty good. We've been able to work together, those of us in Michigan particularly, to work across the aisle and make sure that whether it is direct support for people who are unemployed, or help for small businesses, or healthcare needs that are going unmet, or I think the very important issue of supporting state and local government, we actually have been able to come together. My hope is that we can translate some of the unity of this crisis to some of the other big long-term questions that this country faces, such as the issue of racism that we've seen.
Congressman Bergman, speaking specifically about the death of George Floyd and the response that we have seen around the state, what can Congress do? What should you be doing in response to that?
Well, thanks for letting me comment on that tonight, because number one, we all of us, Democrat, Republican, young and old, black, white, you name it, stand with the family of George Floyd. There is no room for bad actors in our country, whether they be bad cops, bad individuals, bad, period. We are a country that was founded by people who had a very, very, very deep faith. And I ask people every day, what's the opposite of love? Most people will say hate. I would suggest to you it is fear. What we fear could, if we allow it, devolve into hate. My colleagues and I work every day in DC, face-to-face, now more virtually face-to-face. But it's about love of our country. It's about standing for who we are and standing for others who can't stand for themselves. We need leadership, especially at all levels, but especially in the state and local communities and law enforcement. You've seen it every day. I mean, you saw it with the sheriff of Genesee County yesterday. We had protests and peaceful protests in 1st District today, Houghton and Alpena, where the police marched with the protesters. We are about love. We are about faith. That's how we founded this country. That's how we move forward.
Thank you for that. Now, Congresswoman Lawrence, how do you believe that we should all come together?
We either try to connect.
This country that we are so proud to be citizens of, the United States of America, is not identified by ethnicity, by any group of sameness. We are Americans based on embracing ideas, beliefs, and values. And one of the things that this country was founded on is the belief that all men and women are created equal, and that we have rights and freedoms. And so this is the place where my frustration kicks in. When we forget about whether you have a R or D on your back or on your shoulder, and look at, are the values aligned, are our policies aligned with who we are as Americans? And when we do that, we move forward. The example of the HEROES Act, the example of the CARES Act. These are things that we are addressing who we are as Americans, our beliefs and our values. So often, and really now in this environment, we are leaning toward that's a Republican policy or that's a Democratic policy. This country's Constitution is not a Republican or Democrat Constitution. It was one that was fought out by two bodies. And if I have one major criticism, in the Senate, the leadership refused to even bring a bill to the floor for the Senate to vote it up or vote it down or even debate it and change it to policies that they feel are reflective of who we are as Americans. And when we can get to that point where we are not voting because we're Republican or because we are Democrat, but does that bill contain what is best for this country? That's how we move forward. And this death of this man by a human being in a uniform has brought this country to the point that, do we really value life? Do we really believe that all people, regardless of the color of their skin, should be treated with justice and be treated equally and fairly? And so many people are waking up. And to me, I'm praying, because this has been 400 years in the making, that we have finally come to a point where white people, as well as Black people, understand that this is a country where we value lives regardless of the color of our skin.
Congressman Amash, in the wake of all of this and what we've seen happen, is there anything Congress can do to help address some of those systemic problems?
Well, first, what happened to George Floyd was absolutely horrific. And it's an experience faced by millions of people every year. There are millions of people, particularly in our Black and brown communities, who fear for their lives when police officers come. So they're worried that if someone calls the police on something that's a minor infraction, they might actually sustain serious injury or death or be dragged away in handcuffs. So we have to address the real concerns facing people and understand how people view this relationship with police officers. You know, it depends on where you're from, whether you think the police are doing great work every day or whether you think that there are a lot of troubles. And we need to recognize that and try to work together as a community. As far as Congress is concerned, I've introduced legislation in this week where we're going to introduce it on qualified immunity. And this is a doctrine that says that police officers who commit violations of constitutional law, where they violate someone's civil rights, they are largely immune from liability. It's very hard for someone to press for civil action against these officers, and we need to change that. We need to make sure that police officers are liable, just like you and I would be liable if we harmed someone. And I think it's really important that we work together in a bipartisan manner to pass this legislation. It would be one of the most important changes we could make in the law to ensure that all people are treated equally under the law.
Congressman Walberg, what can you do at the federal level to create some understanding?
I think one of the things, and I appreciate the comments of my colleagues, but one of the things we need to hop on right now is the fact that I think if it isn't 100%, it's close to 100% of Americans right now believe that George Floyd was murdered, and that a police officer and 3 officers looking on perpetrated that crime. There isn't a disagreement. And in a time where we see a lot of disagreements and separation and disunity in our country, this is an opportunity to jump on it. As I watched the first time that horrific video last week, probably many people don't know, my colleagues know, that I'm a member of Congress that has an African son-in-law. a daughter and son-in-law that I performed the wedding ceremony for. And as I watched the face of George Floyd, I pictured my son-in-law there. It was a horrific sight. And I think there's a time right now that America can come together, and we can look at some of the issues relative to ferreting out the bad actors amongst our police officers, which are very few. But this group of four sullied everybody. We talked today about the idea of looking at how we can bring the federal government, not to meddle with the states and the locals, but when a police officer like the officer who murdered George Floyd had 12 insurrections against him already, why was he still continuing on?
My co-host, Sherry Jones from WLNS, and I had an opportunity to ask each of our representatives about the fallout from the death of George Floyd. When we come back, we'll hear from our two United States senators about their thoughts. To the point. Welcome back to the Point. This past week, Wood TV and WLNS in Lansing, our sister station, hosted a town hall with 10 members of the U.S. House of Representatives, all from the Michigan delegation, and our two U.S. senators from Michigan. One of the topics was the death of George Floyd and the aftermath, the rioting that we saw in Kalamazoo, in Grand Rapids, in Detroit, and elsewhere, and the peaceful protests that we also saw. We talked to our members about what their role was in trying to heal the state and nation. Now you'll hear from our two U.S. senators.
What resources will you use to determine the best way to eradicate systemic racism in our country? And Senator Peters, we will begin with you.
Well, thank you. And it is an incredibly important question, particularly after the horrific incident and the murder of George Floyd. Certainly all of our hearts go out to the family, and we understand that unfortunately this is not something that happens occasionally. It happens time and time again all across our country, and we have to deal with the systemic issues underlying racism and the criminal justice system that has not performed in a way that is equitable. That in this country, everybody, no matter who you are, no matter where you live, should be treated equally under the law. There are a number of things we need to do, although one particular effort that I've been engaged in is to create a national commission on criminal justice. Actually, this was something that was done 50 years ago during a very difficult time in our history in the 1960s, and a need to take a comprehensive look at the criminal justice system. Over 200 recommendations came out of that commission. Most all of them were adopted. We made major changes. Some of them were fairly straightforward, like when you dial 911 on your phone, that actually came out from the Criminal Justice Commission 50 years ago. Well, a lot has happened in 50 years, and we still have a long ways to go, and we need to revisit that. In fact, after the horrible events in Ferguson and President Obama's report that came out, their top recommendation was to have this kind of broad commission that'll do a complete look. And the bill that I've introduced, and we actually passed it in the Senate in the last session, and we'll hopefully pass it again and send it over to the House, has broad bipartisan support. My bill has 20 co-sponsors, roughly half Republicans, half Democrats. I've got the support of every major group associated with the criminal justice issue. That means all of the major civil rights groups, the NAACP, the Urban League, National Action Network, as well as all the major law enforcement groups representing police officers and prosecutors. It's important to get everybody around the table and put together a comprehensive plan to deal with all of the aspects of the criminal justice system. It's complex. We have to deal with it in a comprehensive way, and we have to have the political will to get it done. And the way to do that is to do it in a bipartisan way and get everybody together from across the ideological spectrum. We've done it before in this country. We did it 50 years ago. It wasn't perfect, but it moved us in the right direction. We need to do it again, and now is the time to make it happen.
Senator Stabenow, in the wake of the death of George Floyd and the reaction that we've seen around the nation and right here in our state, what can you do from a federal level to try to heal some of that pain and try to end some of the systemic racism?
Well, Rick, it's great to be with you, to both you and Sherry, and I appreciate this discussion this evening. You know, it is horrible what happened, and I think all of us watching that video were stunned. I know I felt that I wished I could go right into the video and push the officer off of George Floyd's neck, and it was stunning to see that there was not an action to do that. And I'm very glad that there are charges being brought this evening. Certainly, these kinds of things have gone on. They're too often and too long. And I understand the pain that people feel and the anger and the fear that people fear, and this has got to change. I do believe we're at a point now where there's an opportunity to do that. I think federally for us, even though decisions are made locally by local prosecutors and mayors and states and so on, we do provide federal funding, and it's very important that we make sure that we are tying that to more accountability, transparency, training. We are working as a Democratic caucus. I hope this will be bipartisan. Senator Cory Booker and Kamala Harris are leading us on a package of bills that would address those things.
We had originally planned our town hall to talk to our lawmakers about the coronavirus, and we did. But there were other events that were overshadowing everything that was going on, and we focused on those as well. If you'd like to see the entire town hall, you can go to woodtv.com. And I'll be back with a final comment in a moment. So now the state and the nation grapple with social injustice and racial disparity that has been there for decades, but has been highlighted by the death of George Floyd. We will continue to get reaction about that, and we're still following the coronavirus. Plus, there is legislative work to be done, and we'll be talking about that every Sunday morning to the point.